Go.
Good afternoon, Occupy Boston. Hey, it's nice to be here. This is falling. Hang on. I'm gonna slouch a little bit. Good afternoon, it's beautiful weather. It's always a pleasure to be at Occupy Boston. It's especially a pleasure to be here today, hosting today's lecture in the Howard Zinn Memorial Lecture Series. Today's speaker is Professor Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with her long-standing work in this country on the left with SDS, with the women's movement, with the anti-war movement, with indigenous peoples movements, with the labor movements. We're really quite lucky to have Professor Dunbar-Ortiz here with us. She's a professor of history, and it's just such a treat to have her with us. Please help me welcome her to Occupy Boston.
There's a hole in this soapbox.
There's a couple of them.
Thank you. I was warned that there's a hole. It's so good to be here and to see this. I visited a few Occupies. Of course, I'm in the Bay Area. We have a notorious one now, a heroic one, Oakland. Yay! Oakland. And San Francisco, we have a smaller one, but one that's very militant. And I went to Baltimore, Washington, D.C. There are two. Oklahoma City, Tulsa. I'm from Oklahoma. So I am so excited about what you're doing, and as a 60s veteran, you probably know, most of you are younger, but how there's one of mine, how we've been grumbling all these years, why don't these young people do something, and not providing maybe as much leadership as we could have, but we're definitely all fired up and ready to support in any way we can and be a part of it. And it's not a passing thing. I mean, this is what we might call, you know, the beginning that we should see no end to. One of the things I learned in my younger days, you know, beginning to be, I called myself a revolutionary then. It seems a little hyperbolic now to call myself a revolutionary, but radical, whatever, very politically radical. We had access to the Vietnamese who were fighting the United States. We would meet with them in various foreign countries like Canada, Montreal, Vancouver. Some went to Czechoslovakia and other places, and some went to Vietnam. I didn't. And what they always emphasize, two things they emphasize to us. One is that they had fought for 1,000 years, generation to generation, and that it's a culture of resistance. And that if we didn't think that way, we would constantly be disappointed and dispirited when there were lows, when it looked like nothing was happening, when the enemy was getting stronger and stronger. The other thing I learned from them was you must love your own people. As many of us were became very resentful. They especially emphasized that we had to love our own soldiers who were victims and not the enemy. And so I think if we remember some fundamentals like that, or learn them, and let them guide us, we'll be much stronger and understand it's the long haul. It's not all the media and the powers that be, they want to know the demands. What are the demands? What do you want? I want a list, and I think the brilliance of this movement is it's very clear what the demands are. But if you enumerate them, then you leave out people, the 99%, because it's a big umbrella and there are many things. If you start listing them, then it diminishes the principle of people's power, of collective mutual aid, of caring for each other. And what you've developed is a witness to that, an example of that. This is what we want, is people together, people helping each other, a caring society. And if those fundamentals, everything after that comes, like free health care, adequate housing, education, it's just that's how it has to be, based on those principles. Well, I want to say before I forget that I am proud to be on this soapbox that is in the name of Howard Zinn, the memory of Howard Zinn, and that it's the lecture series named after him. Howard was a really good friend of mine and mentor for the past 40 years. And I miss him terribly. He's the most generous person I think I ever met. He and Noam Chomsky, sort of the twins of the Boston area, the giants who are, Noam was also a mentor of mine for 40 years, and I heard he spoke here first, and that makes sense. So I feel very humble being on this soapbox, and also energized, and just wishing Howard could be here to see this. He wouldn't be surprised, actually, as many people were, because he always had faith in people, especially young people, and never ever said, why isn't someone doing this or that? You know, he just set an example. And that's what we all have to do, I think. Well, I wanted to, you know, they asked me for a name for what I was going to say today. So I said, kind of the obvious, the city on the hill. But I added to it where it all began. So I guess, you know, the upshot of what I want to say is that Wall Street began right here in the city on the hill with the Puritans, with the initial settlement of the country. It began with colonialism, began with British imperialism, that the United States then broke away from. And I say, you know, it broke away from in the same way that South Rhodesia broke away from Rhodesia once it was going to become an independent Zimbabwe. It broke away as an independent oppressive state instead of a... And we have a lot of rhetoric and brainwashing about how we have to think about the United States. And because I come from a Native American perspective, an indigenous perspective, I can never see it that way. And I don't think there can be two things that are right. One story, the official story, and the indigenous story. I think we have to accept that the indigenous story is the correct history of the United States. And right now, I was, you know, actually challenged by Beacon Press to write this book called Indigenous Perspective on the History of the United States. And it is a real challenge to write this down. And it's such a depressing story, really not upbeat. But I think in a way, I think the truth is always upbeat, because it's better to be living with reality and seeing what you're working with and why we've been so unsuccessful with so many movements. You look back in the last, as Howard accounts in his People's History of the United States, just read that book and see the many, many constant struggles, huge. People dying for workers' rights, people, Black Panthers assassinated, almost half their numbers, American Indian movement, same thing. And from the beginning, you have my most exemplary, to me, the most exemplary movement was the abolitionist movement. And to me, that is the essence of what should be the history of Beacon Hill, of Boston, the city on the hill, is the abolitionists were, this was headquarters for the most radical abolitionist movement, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, the Grimke sisters, Sojourner Truth. And so I began thinking of an alternate history. I've been proposing this for a long time in a lot of places, and we have a kind of free university thing beginning in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it's one of the things we want to do. We have a labor fest there in which we celebrate the general strike of 1934, the 1946 Oakland general strike, and now we'll forever be celebrating the Occupy movement. But we also try to dig deep into the labor of the Indians, the mission, the Indians that the Franciscans missionized and made into slaves. Those quaint little missions all along the California coast on the El Camino de Real, the Royal Highway. The center of each one of those was a whipping post, and they built all the churches and the cathedrals. What about that labor? So excavating, drilling deeper. And one thing you'll find not going very far, very long, given the history of Boston, is the abolitionist movement. And when I got involved in the civil rights movement, because I was also a historian, I saw it as very much a parallel of the abolitionist movement. And only beautifully, it was immediately led by African Americans, of course, and that was a great power. Abolitionist movement was started by William Lloyd Garrison, was a printer, was a laborer, and it really was started by several labor organizations who, pre-Marx, this was in the 1820s, 1830s, pre-socialism, communism, saw capital as the enemy, capitalism, and that the working people, their wages were undercut by free labor, which is really what slave labor is free. You don't pay them anything, not even their upkeep. They had to raise their own gardens, their own food, and that for their owners. So they were free labor. And this hurt the workers. So that was the first nudge, and I think we forget those connections. And then when it really got going, so many women got involved because women had no rights at all, and they identified closely with African Americans. And the slave codes that were inscribed in the South during the colonial period and that were taken over in the different states of the South, they were exactly the same codes as applied to the family code, the rights of women. No rights, basically no rights, no right to vote, no right to property, no right to inheritance, no right to divorce, no right to the children. If a woman left, she couldn't take the children. So they were very similar. None other than Hillary Rodham, when she was Hillary Rodham right here at Wellesley, wrote her senior thesis, and then when she went to law school, published it as a law review article on the comparison of the slave code and women's rights in the early 19th century. I don't think she talks about that much today. I only learned it because it was exposed when her husband was running for president. And I said, God, what happened to her anyway? That was a great thesis. But I thought, well, why is it? I began thinking this in the civil rights movement, in the beginning of the anti-war movement. What came out of the abolitionist movement when they were trying to speak at Faneuil Hall and women got up to speak is they were arrested. Women were not allowed to speak in public. And so they fought that, and they fought that law and got the right for women to speak. And they called that movement feminism. At that time, in the 1830s, 1837, they started calling it feminism. And men could be feminists too. William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass always proudly said that they were feminists. And so I was thinking, as it became more and more apparent to me in the movement that women did all the work and men took the credit for it, and were the ones interviewed and on television and all, and the ones who supposedly did the theory that counted, that there really needed to be a women's movement like what came out of the abolitionist movement. So I helped start that in 1967, 68. Right here in Boston. Cell 16. I actually moved here. Now you're going to think this is kind of foolish, but I was pretty young and I was imbued with history. I was a graduate student. And I decided to come to Boston to start a women's liberation movement, as in my Hegelian mind, I was trying to become a Marxist, but I obviously had not gotten past Hegel, in thinking that somehow in the air here, the DNA, in the very moisture of things, that it would just come out if I said, women's liberation, feminism, all that history would just envelop all the women, and there'd be this big women's liberation movement. Well, it wasn't exactly like that, but you know, we did really dig into the history here and use that a lot and get into women in the community that in other places the women's liberation movement really weren't able to attract, because they were mainly using the language of the 60s radical movement. And so I think history is very important, and it as Howard did, that it's not something that's just knowledge. I mean, that's good to have knowledge, but it's something that